Welcome back, everyone. We are now moving to our next panel discussion. The numbers of cities, organizations, and countries committing to net zero by 2050 is increasing every day. Zero carbon buildings represent a critical climate solution. In Australia, buildings account for almost 30% of national emissions and more than half of energy use. Heating and cooling are responsible for as much as 40% of energy use and represent a key opportunity to achieve net zero emission. With this in mind, the question to the panel today is, how can HVAC accelerate and help deliver the net zero building of the future? After the panel, we will have the opportunity to take some questions. So please, again, submit your question in the Q&A box. I'm now going to introduce our three panelists, and then we will listen to this presentation. Okay. Yes, we are all here. Yeah. Okay, so on the panel today, we have Michael Lee. Michael is Senior Project Manager for Cities and Policy with Climate Works Australia. Michael has a long experience in sustainability, and his focus is on reducing carbon emissions from cities. Welcome, Michael. Next is Davina Rooney. Davina is the CEO of Green Building Council Australia. Davina is a property professional with a broad range of sustainability experience. And next we have Chris Bontine. Chris is an experienced sustainability consultant and sustainability manager with North Slope Consulting Engineers. He's also a leading collaborator and facilitator of the Melbourne Living Building Collaborative and Engineers Declare. So thank you for all of you, to join this panel today. Now, over to you, Michael.
Fantastic. Thank you, Caroline, for the introduction. And thank you to the Atmosphere Conference team for the invitation to present to you today. So for those of you who aren't founded about 10 years ago by Monash University and the Maya Foundation to provide independent evidence-based advice to government and business on opportunities to decarbonise Australia's economy. We're probably best known, for those of you who are familiar with Climeworks, probably best known for our work on economy-wide transitions to a net zero emissions Australia. But I actually work in our cities and policy team, which focuses on how can we take advantage of the modelling and the analysis that we've done on economy-wide transitions towards decarbonised economy and apply that strategy to help enable that broader transition. So why do we talk about net zero emissions by 2050? Back in 2015, the global community signed the Paris Climate Agreement, which committed the world to limiting global warming to below 2 degrees below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with an aspiration to achieve limit this global warming to 1. Thus, is that in order to achieve that, the world needs to be transitioning to a net zero economy by around 2050 or earlier. And actually targeting that net zero emissions target by 2050 is fast becoming a norm. It may not be well known that all of Australia's either target or policy target and aspiration economy 2050. So in effect, has a target state and territory commitments. almost largest have also gas emissions in line with the Paris climate. Property companies include Novak, GPT Group, Vicinity Centres, Investor. So there's growing momentum towards targeting net zero emissions by 2050 and taking action, particularly in the property sector, to achieve that target. Back in March, we published a report called Decarbonisation Futures, which shows how the gap between where we are today with Australia's emissions and those net zero emissions targets by 2050 in line with the Paris Agreement can be bridged. Of Australia, progress and a series of pathways for the Australian sector to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Based on this, we identified a range of actions that government, businesses and individuals can take to support these emissions reductions. And we looked at scenarios that illustrated a range of possible pathways with a differing mix of policy, social and technology development levers. And from that, the scale that are required across different sectors of the economy that would align with the Paris goals. And so what I'll be talking about today are some of the outcomes of this research that are relevant to the building sector and that are relevant to HVAC. So what the scenario shows is that we might be building a key role in the transition to a net zero emissions economy. Has been demonstrated at scale. And it's critically important for the building sector to play this role because of the fact that the opportunities are cost effective within the building sector, and particularly when compared to other sectors of Australia's economy like agriculture, long haul freight, a lot more research, but that's opportunity. Well before 2050, reduce the need to decarbonise. The building sector will reduce its emissions by 60 to 30 compared to the 2 degrees scenario and 2 degrees of warming. Push that to 2 degrees, then the would emission 3%. Much of this would come from increased energy, but as well, energy performance of buildings, those emissions. Even where the electricity by between 70 and 79% renewable energy by 2030, the energy performance of the residential building stock would still need to improve by at least 44 to 48% by 2030 compared to today. And in the same performance of commercial buildings would need to improve by 16 to 25%. So still some pretty significant improvements that are shown to be achievable in our scenarios for the building sector to align with emissions in accordance with international climate agreements. So specifically to HVAC, what we did in our scenarios is we tested a range of different solutions that are available building being cooling, thermal storage, and optimization of the control. Is that the new known technologies? All of these are mature technologies. And also it's not comprehensive. So for example, the modelling didn't include natural refrigerants, it didn't include efficiency. What the scenarios show is that by incorporating these known technologies and accelerating the deployment of these known technologies and known HVAC in order to contribute to those targets. So just to conclude, because I realised that some of you, so apologies for that. Just please go to the link that will be in the slides that are sent around. And also, I mentioned before by different companies, net zero momentum tracker that's shown in the link there. So, and I'll hand over to back.
Thank you, Michael. We had some technical issue with the audio, but I'm sure it will be better when we get to the question. Thank you. Next is Davina Rini. Davina, over to you.
Fantastic. And look, thanks everyone. It wouldn't be a digital conference if we didn't have at least one audio issue. So thank you so much for bearing with us. Just to provide context, the way this session works is Michael gave us, ClimateWorks does this extraordinary piece modelling, taking the Paris scenarios and translating those across multiple industries. I'm very privileged to have Anna Scarbeck, who is the CEO of ClimateWorks on the board of the Green Building Council. Our role is to then take some of those concepts, take some of those megatrends, and then translate that into standards advocacy, practical tools that we work with in industry. And then we're so privileged to have Chris, who's, one of the key consultants working with Northrop, GBCA member, who seeks to take these constructs and work with industry to absolutely deploy them into practice. So my role in this is to give you a very brief snapshot of our role of context in this aspect, how it relates to net zero, and the work that we'd love to unpack with you is how do we take these constructs and absolutely bring them and deploy them in industry. So I mentioned I work with the Green Building Council of Australia. Many of you will be familiar with us, but a very brief insight of what we do is we rate, we use our rating tool Green Star, we advocate, we seek to partner with governments to take these constructs and actually implement them into a combination of minimum standards and acceleration programs. We educate, we partner with industry on events like these and indeed our own to kind of spread the knowledge. And really importantly, we collaborate because, the entire themes of your conference is how do we take these things and replicate them at every project. So, some of the themes is how do we draw down the Paris Agreement? How do we draw down those global megatrends? And for us, we see that there's three macro global megatrends on the environmental side at the moment that are really driving industry. So that's climate action, which Michael talked extensively about, resource efficiency or circular economy, and health and well-being. And within all of those, air conditioning has a really critical role as we sort of reimagine, whether it's, some of the items that Michael referenced, how do we actually take those systems and make them far more efficient, drive them to net zero, or how do we improve the air quality? And I think there's been, let's call it a renaissance of awareness in the current situation. People have never discovered how uncomfortable their homes are and how unwell they at times make them, or, how important it is for air quality and having these things to be clean and actually really unpack what that looks like in different scenarios. And that came obviously after a horror summer of bushfires where, so some of the key stats that we used to use about the World Health Organization having the perspective that 90% of areas weren't meeting their air quality requirements. Historically in Australia, we used to say, no, that's not the case here. But, after the horror summer of bushfires, all of a sudden air quality was right back on the agenda. And many of you will be working through key solutions in that space. Now, as we seek to unpack those, Michael sort of talked about the Paris Agreement and macro, where we've got to go. One of the things that we do as a partner who delivers tools and standards is actually take things like the National Construction Code, implement those in standards and seek to then beat those to actually align at our best practice standard, which we call 4-star within Green Star, and actually line up industry to hit that as a goal. But really importantly for our world leadership, when we launch our standards in September, we're saying that any building that's saying it has international leadership really needs to be heading for net zero. And even at a Australian excellence building, that a building has to know what net zero ready, so be on that pathway for that net zero transition. And as I'm sure we're going to unpack in discussion, so much of that relates to electrification, different things in services, refrigerants, a whole complex myriad that many of you spend your days resolving. Now, I know this content's available, going to be available to individuals afterwards. So what I've sought to do is within our rating tool, just put boxes highlighting what the absolute key areas are that relate to air conditioning, and noting that those come across the different categories of how we deliver things that are responsible, how we look after commissioning, building handover, those areas we're passionate about, how we look at healthy, which is to do with air quality, noise, acoustics, those areas, and how we actually seek to change the impact we have on the environment, which is very focused in the positive category, which is all about energy efficiency, integration with renewables, what that does for water efficiency in those contexts. So often in these constructs, we say, fantastic, we have a conversation, we get all the leaders together in a space like this, but how do we actually scale that? So something that the Green Building Council has partnered with the Property Council about, we launched last September with Minister Taylor a document called Every Building Counts. And that's a practical plan for how we actually take our entire economy to net zero, and it's broken at a federal, state and local area. And the construct of that is at a federal area, we're talking about the National Construction Code, how we take those aspects to break that down. At a state level, we're often talking about the procurement practices of, the different government bodies at that level. And then at local area, we're talking about how we do green door planning and incentives. So this actually covers the whole suite of how we take net zero forward, but really seeks to segment the critical areas and try and unpack some of the intractable areas that have been challenges for net zero buildings. The other intention of this document is to advocate for government that net zero buildings are actually relatively straightforward. As you all know, they're highly efficient buildings powered by renewables. So it's to look through the key difference of policy and regulation as well that we need to boost to actually have this happening more and more. So to give some context to that, how do we transition from the 2016 construction code? We were highly engaged in the 2019 construction code, which saw a 35% increase in efficiency requirements. That covers all asset classes apart from residential. And there's a very high engagement at the moment on the trajectory for buildings. Now, the reason for this is that COAG decided in February 2019 that we would take the codes on a trajectory to net zero energy by 2030. And so one of our roles is to partner with the departments to enable that, work with industry like yourselves, but really work through some of these areas. And the current focus is on residential because there's due to be a National Construction Code update in 2022. Now, when we talk about how voluntary standards come together with regulatory requirements, I think this is a graph from Neighbours. A number of you would have been engaged at the Neighbours conference about a week and a half ago. But what it shows is how leadership programs really come together with regulation. So we actually see here the early leaders who were using Neighbours program voluntarily, and they've had about a 50% reduction on their carbon reductions. What's very exciting is that about, when we started tracking the leaders in about 2005-06, going all the way back, excitingly, when we introduced compliance requirements, we saw a 35% reduction from those who were enforced to use Neighbours program. So this tells us a couple of things: what gets measured gets managed, and that if we actually train up and use voluntary programs to train at scale across the supply chain, if we then apply minimum requirements, we can really accelerate the trajectory in that context. So that's one of the reasons why the Green Building Council is working very heavily in the home space, because we'd like to take and normalise some of that language across all areas. So we're advocating for net zero energy, healthy and resilient homes. And tomorrow we'll be launching a standard for volume home builders. And we're excited to have quite a number of partners in that space. And importantly, Australia's largest home builder, so that we can try and take these constructs and scale them so that if you walk into, that you can buy one of these and take that home from a mainstream operator, which is the change we need to see so that we can actually make it available and actually lift regulatory standards. So for ourselves, what we seek to do is work with the leading partners to set net zero energy within their existing buildings, because let's face it, you know, there's so many existing buildings. The battle for sustainability is going to be won and lost in efficient existing buildings, and that's a key cornerstone piece of work that we absolutely need to be advocating in this space. And we're really thrilled that we partnered with the World Green Building Council to bring a net zero 2030 commitment. And we have a huge uptake in the Australian consortium, and all of these groups have committed to net zero by 2030. Wonderfully, a number of them are actually including across their existing portfolios, not just new build. And this has been a game changer as we start to have this conversation. So one of the things that we're really excited about is you're not just seeing the conventional property groups there. You'll start to see names like Commonwealth Bank taking this across their large property portfolio, or working with Monash University. We're very excited. And what you'll hear as a theme in this is when we look for a net zero Australia, we talk about the carrot, the stick and the tambourine. So the carrot, the voluntary programs, you know, be they something like, you know, Green Star, which we operate and advocate for, the stick being regulation, but we all talk about celebration and leadership programs, which we call the tambourine, where we actually sustain excitement and engagement in this space as we drive to really important goals. So look, I'm going to hand over to Chris for further discussion on this before we get to unpack some of the themes and what it means to you in the panel discussion. So thank you very much for me. I'll hand back to Caroline.
Thank you, Davina. Great presentation and some really exciting initiatives coming up. Thank you. Now next is Chris Buntine. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real privilege to be on this panel with Michael and Davina, who, you know, through their organisations are really doing amazing things to shift the industry and to accelerate change. I guess I wear two hats today, one as a practitioner with Northrop as their sustainability leader, but also working with Engineers Declare as one of their founders, trying to shift practice in other ways to complement what existing organisations are doing. And so my talk is really a little bit more at the project level, the design team level, if you like, designing for the whole rather than the parts, because I think this can be a key part of how we need to shift our thinking, because really it's not about just designing for net zero. We actually need to contribute to the health and vitality of living systems. And so we need to change the way we work, I think. And engineers have a huge opportunity for impact and to amplify the work that they do. It's been really inspiring to see the healthcare workers around the world, in Australia, but particularly places like New York, where it got to the point where the community was coming out every evening to celebrate what they were doing, recognising the investment they were making and the risks they were taking around their health and well-being for the good of their community. And it got me thinking, you know, what would it take in this time of a climate and biodiversity emergency for people to come out and ride on the footpath about the engineers? The engineers, we got this, right? So what are the things that engineers are doing to step up and really show that they have a transformational impact that goes beyond just their projects? It's really contributing to our future and to the future of all of life. And I think that's sort of an exciting theme of change. But, you know, it's interesting to look at the HVAC and refrigeration industry. They've already got a track record of being very aware of the work that they do and the industry's impact on the planet. And it's really the poster child for change, having the right policy, technologies and will on the part of industry to drive that change. And that's the kind of model we want to take forward to going to other parts of the engineering industry, into the way we work as design teams, is recognising that link, thinking about the whole, thinking about the connectedness of what we do on a day-to-day basis and its impact on our communities and our planet. And this has really been the impetus for the Declare movements, which is a really exciting opportunity for people to come together and share their enthusiasm for change, to support and build capability across the industry. Engineers Declare is out there, but obviously architects declare, builders declare, planners declare. It's hard to keep up, actually. There's quite a few declare movements, and they're all very aligned in their thinking that they want to accelerate change and have a very positive view of the opportunities that brings to people in the industry, to our local economy, and to our future. So it's an exciting thing to be a part of, and really recommend you all check it out if you haven't signed up already. And so when we think about the health of systems, what do we mean? It's complex. There's living systems. We talk about living systems thinking, what does it mean? So this diagram here is inspirational to me. It was developed by a guy called Eric Sanderson, who wrote a book called Mannahatta. And what he did is he studied New York, really looked at a New York City block. And he said, I want to understand all of the living systems that were present in that land back in 1609, before modern settlement of that area. And so he actually pieced together the ecosystem that was there, something you could do in any city in the world. And he identified 1,600 different species and habitats and 8,000 relationships. And he put all those together to understand how they all supported each other and how did these networks work. It's a fascinating piece of work. And so this is actually a multi-dimensional chart. You're only seeing two dimensions, but actually one of those dots is humans, just one. All the others are the other parts of the living system. And we often need to be reminded we're part of a larger, evolving, thriving living system that needs to work together. And those relationships are more important than the individual elements themselves. And we're just slowly, we need to accelerate our understanding of what this means, because we have living systems failing all around us. And never before have we been so aware of our interconnectedness with ecosystems, with communities, with supply chains. Our economies are vulnerable. There's a lot of connectedness that we're being made aware of lately. So what does this thinking mean in terms of engineering practice? And one of the ways to look at it is building regenerative capacity, building the capacity of us to deliver, health and vitality to living systems. And that starts with ourselves. It starts with what's our own worldview? What's that lens that we look at our work through? Is it mechanistic, which is the idea of we reduce everything down to discrete elements and problem solving, which is very much part of how we design often. And that's a problem, because when we talk about net zero, we're talking about the whole energy carbon system. And that's contributed by nearly everybody on a typical design team for a building or infrastructure project. So we need to think about what's our own capacity to see the potential for change and to bring a real sense of leadership to our work, and recognise that we all contribute. In the second line of work here, the image is not quite showing up here on the chart, but the second line of work is your design team itself. When I think of renewable energy, I don't necessarily just think of electrons. I think of the energy and vitality in the room of a project team. How enthusiastic are people? Do they have an aligned vision around what they're trying to do that pulls people together and inspires and gives a sense of direction? And I think what we should look to is building up that capability within project teams to think differently, to act differently. And I think often there's a lack of energy and enthusiasm around the idea of sustainability and driving change. It's seen as maybe an add-on, an afterthought. It's expensive, complex, but actually it's something that really excites and energizes a lot of people, and there's a lot of capacity that we bring as engineers, and it can really be unlocked if we have the right approach to the way the design team works. And then the third line of work being contributing to that greater living system, to changing the industry, to changing practice, to making our communities more livable or vibrant, or just changing the world globally. That calling is deeply satisfying if we feel like we're contributing to a larger purpose. And it's about looking at the whole. And this daisy here, it's not like a piece of kit. It's beautiful in its whole, and everything's connected and integrated. And we need to really look and study building performance in the same way, whether it's energy, water, materials, waste, or other things. We need to look at how all of these things work together. And actually, this flower is a yam daisy, murnong. It was actually a key staple food source for the Aboriginals. And when we settled Australia, we destroyed this crop for Aboriginals. So they basically starved to death in many places, and then turned to hunting sheep, and that caused all kinds of tension with the early settlers. So that flower was connected to a huge system. It's a perfect example. It's not just a flower; it's a whole part of an ancient civilization in Australia. So we need to be careful of understanding the nested systems that we're studying and designing and being a part of. But it's also going beyond carbon or biodiversity. And what's really exciting about all the action around carbon is we're actually looking at all the other connected aspects of design. So we're looking at the materials. We're looking at where those materials come from and how does it impact, equity and well-being for people around the planets. We're looking at health and well-being. We're looking at, circular materials flows, wastes, transport, food is another part of it. So all of these things are connected, and actually we need to nurse those things through the design team process to really understand how we're driving outcomes across as many aspects of holistic systems thinking that we can. And how do we bring people together and get them excited at the beginning of a project, thinking about not problem solving, but potential realizing what could be. There's a lot of challenges in the industry, cost and complexity and technology, and it didn't work last time. So but each project is quite unique, particularly in the building industry. So understanding that place and that community and that unique collection of practitioners that's come together. And so it's kind of get around the campfire and get excited and let's tell some stories about what we think the project could be. Often that is missing on projects, but I think it can play a really key role in the design process. And I guess getting more granular here, there is a good process for doing this. It's called the integrative design process and comes under other names. It says we're going to get together in our design team and think in systems, design in systems. The energy system, there's all these practitioners that contribute to the energy system. So when we're designing the HVAC system, how does that contribute to energy performance? Well, now it's linked to the facade. It's linked to behaviour and indoor comfort. And passive design of the building itself. So we actually need to design in that way. The same with water. It amazes me on projects where nobody is really looking at the whole water system. We're all looking at pieces of it. And if you ask a design team, how's your water system performing? Nobody can tell you because we didn't design at the system level. It was just, 6 or 7 different practitioners did a great job in isolation. So it's a great opportunity to think about how do we come together, think about the systems, work out what the benchmarks are, what we're trying to drive, go away, test the ideas, come back together again. What did we learn? What do we need to change? And slowly working our way through the design process to drive outcomes in a much more integrated way. Frankly, we're going to have to use processes like this because we need to be driving levels of performance we've never achieved before, and to really get carbon footprints down. So, but it's actually a really exciting, engaging way to run a design team. And this goes for costs as well. So let's cost the system. Let's not trade off, well, look, the HVAC system costs this and the facade costs this. You know, they're all working together as part of a system often, you know, around energy and carbon performance. So let's look at them that way. You know, let's ask the quantity surveyors to start price things differently. And let's look at life cycle costs too, which, you know, often don't see on projects, even though we talk about it a lot. It's really not done. So I think there's an opportunity to really reframe this, and I think this, you know, helps amplify the efforts around mechanical design, selection of refrigerants, and really engage and inspire us all. And so I just wanted to leave with a quote here. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find that it's bound fast by 1,000 invisible cords that cannot be broken to everything else in the universe. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. What a great presentation. Okay, now we're going to move to some questions. I've seen that there is question, you know, coming in the Q&A box, but first I have a question for all of you. Do you think that post-COVID and the rebuild of the economy, our cities, and our life will accelerate innovation and the focus on a more sustainable future? Who would you like to answer?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, I think
Chris.
that, I think there's a lot of much more open-minded thinking at the moment. We've all been, our work-life balance has changed. Our lives have been disrupted. Our jobs have been disrupted in some cases. Our economy is changing. We're having to think about localization. We really believe strongly in the global economy, and we still will, but we've seen its limitations. So I think there's, you know, this is a time when we can really start to think about innovation in some really exciting ways, particularly how can we innovate more in Australia? How can we build our manufacturing sector, for instance, to develop more technologies and materials locally? We'll still, you know, compete internationally and source internationally, but we recognise we need some resilience at home as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to foster homegrown innovation, and to think about how this shift to spending more time in our places where we live, in our communities, what it means in terms of how we design those communities, because I think we now place a much greater value in those communities where we live because we're locked down in them.
Michael, would you like to add something?
Yes, sure. And apologies for my audio issues before. Are they better now, Carolyn and the team?
Yeah, it's
Great.
all okay now. All good. Perfect.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, with the what COVID has shown us is that we as a society can shift quite rapidly in response to external changes that are imposed on the way we live, on the way we work. One example of that being the high proportion of time that many of us are spending at home, but also the different ways in which we're using our buildings, the different level of activity that's happening in the city, and as Chris mentioned, the higher value that we as a society are starting to place on localised activity and localised industry. And I think that presents an opportunity for innovations in the building sector to improve energy performance and to decarbonise because of that greater value that we're putting on our places of residence now and our homes. For many of us, it's been an eye-opener on how poorly energy efficient our homes are, and so I guess what we'd hope is that that will lead to greater activity in decarbonisation of our building stock.
Great points. Thank you, Michael. Now, I know that we have a question for you, Davina. So I'm going to push it on the screen. Okay, it's a question from Sam. Hi, Sam, from Conry Tech. Is the Green Building Council Australia involved in any grant or funds to help support companies developing new technology that will make net zero energy building more widespread and achievable.
So we ourselves are a charity, so we don't provide funds in that area, but we work really closely and seek to make available to industry things where different parts of government provide those grants. The other thing that we find is people that use our standards, often they go for innovation points and innovation pathways. And often the first time new technologies get commercialised are on some of these leadership projects and programs, often using those as part of a scale-up through that process. So we ourselves aren't the direct funder of those, but we often bring together parts of industry when those opportunities are achieved, or bring together proponents on the development or owner side and with emerging tech. And often the catalyst for those are met at either our education events or meet through industry, or the things that we're advocating for in tools often become a lot more popular, and industry starts to search for the solution. So we're often the catalyst to bring those things forward.
Thank you, Davina. Well, I want to thank all of you, the three of you. Thank you to our panel. It has been an incredible conversation. Thank you for the time, especially you, Davina. I know that you just came out of a meeting just to speak to this to the conference. So thank you, and I'll speak to you very soon. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.